Schizophrenia can lead to significant dysfunction in a person's life, and I think one of the reasons for this is that it becomes very difficult to actually develop a stable ego, and it can often feel like their psyches are being hijacked by these external autonomous entities. That's why many people with schizophrenia experience auditory hallucinations, usually in the form of these very loud and seizing voices. During these auditory hallucinations, a person's sense of self can seem to diminish, like their ego just evaporates, as this very loud voice takes over. And there are other forms of psychosis where this occurs. In analytical psychology, there's actually a term for this, an abaissement du niveau mental. Sorry if my French is crap. But essentially it refers to the way the ego can evaporate, which leads to this uprush of the unconscious. And oftentimes this occurs through an auditory hallucination. The ego normally acts like a barrier that can filter the contents of the unconscious. For example, if you're having an unpleasant thought and thinking about something cringy that you did in the past, it's your ego which is capable of kind of redirecting your mind and saying, nope, I'm going to think about something else. And so it's in that sense that the ego acts like this barrier. And without this barrier, the unconscious will just kind of pour forth, like this uncontrollable river. So when the barrier dissolves, there's nothing to hold back the unconscious. And in schizophrenia, this can be quite debilitating because, again, it feels like some alien presence is trying to take over your mind. So clearly this is a sign of mental illness in the modern world, but what if in the past this was the norm? People didn't have egos, instead they were all essentially schizophrenic. And instead of telling themselves what to do, these voices, these auditory hallucinations, they took on the role of volition. They were what guided behavior. This could be the mentality that early humans possessed. And in fact, it could explain why humans worshipped gods. Because these gods may have been understood to be the source of these voices. Early humans believed that the gods were speaking to them and telling them what to do through these hallucinations. And in this video, I want to discuss why this mentality could be what occurred in ancient Egypt. Now, obviously, when we talk about a civilization that lasted as long as Egypt, there are some complications. Just think about how much the world has changed in the past 2,000 years since Christ died. Now, realize that ancient Egypt lasted for nearly 3,000 years. So it's easy to speak about ancient Egypt as though it were like a single entity, but really there were these massive transformations that were happening all the time throughout history, and there were different eras of Egyptian history where, like, for example, random foreign invaders would take over the kingdom, but essentially still run it as though it were an Egyptian empire. So just keep in mind that at different points of Egyptian history, things may have been different. And there were also these periods of chaos which were known as intermediate periods where it's unclear what was happening. Luckily for us, the ancient Egyptians developed their own writing system, and by translating these writing systems, we were able to get a glimpse into the minds of these early humans. So the first thing we might want to explore are the gods of ancient Egypt. There are estimated to be nearly 1,400 distinct deities in Egypt throughout history. And of course, throughout history, some gods were considered more important. Sometimes gods blended together to become a single god. So for instance, the god Amun and the god Ra became blended together to become the god Amun-Ra. And they were often associated with particular places. For example, the god of Ptah was the chief deity of the city of Memphis. Gods are also involved in complex mythologies and are said to interact with one another, and they also fulfill very specific roles in nature and society. Here are just some gods to give you a sense of how many there were. Atum, a creator god who apparently created himself. The god Shu, who was said to hold up the sky. Tefnut, which is one of several lion-headed goddesses. And there's a bunch more, like a lot more. The question is, what are these things? What are gods? Because like I said in my last video, it's actually hard to make sense of what these things are and why they were so revered and why they were so central to society. Because in every city, there was usually a temple at the center of the city, and this temple was the seat of government. But it was also the house of the god. The gods were said to inhabit the temples, and in some sense, the temple was this kind of intermediary realm between like the divine realm and the earthly realm. It's almost like a pocket of the divine on the physical plane. And each temple was usually dedicated to a single god, although, you know, there could be various depictions of different gods in the temple. But usually there was one very large statue in the center of the temple, which represented a particular god. And people were somehow able to kind of interact with these statues, and through these statues communicate with the gods. Now, it's hard to say how ordinary Egyptian citizens experienced the gods because for most of Egyptian history, the vast majority of commoners were illiterate, so we don't have much writings pertaining to them. But we do know exactly how the Pharaoh communicated with the gods. The Pharaoh wasn't just the king of Egypt, he was also the head priest of the Egyptian religion. It was his job to communicate with the gods and make sure that their bidding was done in accordance with the concept of Mot. Mot is an ancient Egyptian concept which sometimes translates to truth or to order, but I think the best translation would be the world as conceived by the gods. So the gods kind of have a particular plan for the world, and it's the Pharaoh's job to attempt to kind of uphold this vision. But the Pharaoh wasn't just an intermediary of the god, the Pharaoh was a living god himself. In fact, the Pharaoh was believed to be an incarnation of Horus. Now, according to the theory of the bicameral mind, the reason they're depicted like this is because Horus was a part of the Pharaoh's mind. In fact, Horus spoke to the Pharaoh through auditory hallucinations. And the Pharaoh spoke back to what he believed to be Horus, but was actually just a voice emanating from his own mind. And so there was this divine connection between Horus and the Pharaoh. But the Pharaoh could also seemingly interact with other gods. And why do I keep saying that the gods spoke to the Pharaoh? Well, it's because this is exactly what's written all over the temples. If you go into ancient Egyptian temples today, you can actually see written on the walls various conversations between the god and the Pharaoh. And these conversations are written in hieroglyphs. I found this incredible book while doing research called When Gods Speak to Men, and it essentially is just like a catalog of the various instances throughout history where people seem to be communicating with gods. And the author writes the following. When visiting Egyptian temples nowadays, it is possible to read/hear the conversations between the king and various divinities, the divine words which have been carved on the walls. As an indispensable intermediary between gods and men, the Pharaoh, the priest par excellence, is always shown as the one who faces the gods during the ritual acts of daily divine worship and certain religious ceremonies. A litany of juxtaposed scenes thus depicts the king presenting an offering to different deities with the appropriate gestures, instruments, and words. In return, the god grants benefits to the sovereign, and through him to Egypt as a whole. These benefits are uttered directly by the god in a speech that is usually placed above his face. Examples are innumerable. So just to give you a taste of what these gods were saying, here's just one example which pertains to the pharaoh Sahur, speaking to the god Ash. I'm sorry if my Egyptian pronunciations are incorrect. Ancient Egyptian hasn't been spoken for a while, so I might get some pronunciations wrong here and there. But essentially, the god spoke to the pharaoh and said, "I will give you all that is in this Libya land. I will give you all hostile peoples, with all the provisions that there are in foreign lands. I grant thee all western and eastern foreign lands, with all the Ayunti and the Montui bowmen who are in every land." So essentially the god seems to be commanding the pharaoh to take more land. And here's something that the god Ptah said to one of the pharaohs during the New Kingdom. Ptah said regarding the Libyan enemy, "Collect all his crimes to be turned back upon his head. Place him in the hand of whatever that is, that he may cause him to disgorge what he has swallowed like a crocodile." So yeah, these conversations are extremely commonplace, but we have to ask the question, how exactly did the god speak to the pharaoh? And this becomes less jarring when you realize that it's possible that the pharaoh heard the voice of the god through auditory hallucinations. This readily explains why there are so many conversations like this. Because this reminds me of shamanism, where the shaman attempts to communicate with the gods or with the spirit world through hallucinations. The pharaoh is like the shaman king, talking with the gods in order to get advice from them. And remember, auditory hallucinations feel like the presence of another being. They don't feel like they're coming from your mind. It's like a voice is speaking to you from heaven. That's exactly how it feels. And so it explains why these gods are understood as like these external presences. Now, like I said before, Egyptian history is very complex, and there were these different eras. Ancient Egypt is usually divided into 3 eras: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And in between these kingdoms are these intermediate periods where it was just complete chaos. But it seems that as we move towards the present, it became harder and harder to commune with the gods. For example, in the New Kingdom, i.e. the most recent kingdom, the author of the book notes that there are many instances of the pharaohs speaking to gods in their dreams, and then kind of recording what happened in these dreams later on. So for example, here's one recording. "You are the one who has spoken to me yourself, with your own mouth. I am the beautiful Hathor, my shape being that of goddess Mut. I have come in order to instruct you. Consider your place, take hold of it, without traveling north, without traveling south. While I was in a dream, while the earth was in silence, in the deep of the night." And you might be thinking, doesn't this like posit an alternate explanation for how the gods spoke to the pharaohs? So as opposed to auditory hallucinations, maybe the pharaoh experienced the gods in their dreams. And my answer to that would be that they're basically indistinguishable. A dream is also an abaissement du niveau mental. It is also when the ego dissipates and the unconscious rushes forth. When you go to sleep, your ego disappears, and that's what it causes you to kind of experience a dream hallucination. Really, the difference between a normal person and a schizophrenic is that the normal person only hallucinates when they're asleep, most of the time, whereas a schizophrenic tends to hallucinate during the day as well. So we're all sort of schizophrenic, but because we have strong egos, the unconscious doesn't easily erupt forth until we go to sleep and that ego dissolves. Also notice that in your dream, you can come across beings that speak to you as though they were, external presences. Just last night, I met this eccentric drug dealer in my dreams. But anyways, my point is that your mind can manifest entities which your ego doesn't identify as yourself. They're viewed as like these external people. And they present themselves as autonomous even though they come from your own mind. And this is further corroborated by the fact, with respect to the bicameral mind theory, that dreams seem to largely involve the right hemisphere of the brain. Something which is quite remarkable is the fact that the conversations between the gods and the pharaohs and other people were written on walls of tombs and other buildings, and they seem to play a role in commanding people what to do. For example, physicians may look on the wall and see this inscription by the goddess Isis, and her instructions on how to do a surgery or something. So in a sense, the goddess Isis is teaching people how to do surgeries. So amazingly, gods may have been speaking to people through hieroglyphics. So instead of reading the words as we do today, it may have been a case of looking at hieroglyphics and experiencing them as auditory hallucinations, which again would seem to be like the voice of a god speaking to you. In fact, the word hieroglyphics means something like divine words or words of the gods. So as Egyptian history progresses, it becomes harder and harder to speak with the gods, and they begin to employ oracles in order to try to find out what the gods want. And this book makes a note, which I just chuckle at when I read, there exists a technical terminology for the god's answer to a question asked of him. Yet, Egyptian texts, when this interaction occurs, often use the verb to say when they refer to the god's answer. This is clearly a transposition, with the Egyptians expressing the sense of the oracle, which was not an audible reality. So what the author is essentially saying here is that even though the inscriptions claim that the gods said something, it's not really possible for the gods to speak, being, figments of the imagination. But of course, if we posit the possibility that gods were actually hallucinatory presences, then it does make sense to say that the gods spoke. But again, as Egyptian history progresses, these hallucinations became less and less frequent, and more sophisticated techniques were required in order to bring them forth, such as rituals and prayer. But the author also makes clear that before this period, the gods were talking all the time, as he writes, "The fact remains that Egyptian deities did not stop speaking for 3 millennia. Their words were collected by theologians and written down by Egyptian scribes without commenting on how they conceived or felt about this abundance of divine discourse that surrounded them. The words of the god were not insignificant, but neither were they uncommon. The worshipper walking in the courtyard of the temple could see the pharaoh and the gods talking to each other. The patient consulted a doctor/magician, who occasionally recited divine words to reinforce the effectiveness of his actions. The literature lover could read or listen to adventures featuring the gods quarreling. The voice of the gods seems to have been a part of the daily environments of the ancient Egyptians." Now, from a psychological perspective, it's quite cool when you realize that there were no literal gods speaking to the Egyptians, but rather these gods were inside their minds, and in some sense represented their own unconscious thoughts. And this is particularly interesting because the pharaoh is essentially consulting his own unconscious, which oftentimes can seemingly think in a much more deep and flexible manner than his own self. And various gods could represent sub-personalities within the pharaoh, perhaps representing different archetypes. Maybe that's why there's this divide between masculine gods and feminine gods. And by communicating with specific gods, you're basically communicating with specific parts of your mind. And this readily explains what the gods were and why they were so important for Egyptian society. All of these beautiful paintings and statues were seemingly a way to solidify a connection between a person and the gods. In fact, there are inscriptions which describe how one was supposed to approach these paintings in order to commune with the gods. And so when people believed that the gods were speaking to them, they were actually just accessing the part of their mind which presents itself as an external authority. So really, they were just accessing their own unconscious minds. So this explains why there are so many gods in the first place and why they're taken so seriously. Gods seem to be a very central feature of Egyptian society. And just from all of these images, you could probably quite clearly see that they were involved in every aspect of life. Another thing about ancient Egypt, which is very prominent, is their obsession with death. The Great Pyramids were tombs for deceased pharaohs, but they weren't just casually entombed. These tombs are extremely elaborate. They contain a large number of inscriptions and writings, and are decorated with gold and jewels. And they're often entombed with food, alcohol, even slaves. And remember, pharaohs themselves are also gods. And James posits that one of the reasons that the ancient Egyptians may have believed in the afterlife is that after a pharaoh died, it may have been still possible to hear his voice. Because again, if we think about this in a more sophisticated manner, the commands of the pharaoh, they themselves could be the internal hallucination of a person. A person could be hearing the pharaoh speaking to him, because again, the pharaoh was also a god. And that may explain why the ancient Egyptians went through all this trouble to make sure that the pharaoh was entombed correctly, because in a sense, he was still alive. And this also explains what the Ka is. The Ka was a concept in ancient Egypt, which today is often translated like soul or like vital force. But James believes that the Ka may have actually been the internal auditory hallucination or auditory voice of a person. So when the pharaoh's body died, his Ka survived. And the reason they believed his Ka survived is because you could still hear his voice even after he died. Which makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to infer that from still being able to hear a person's, voice. This is why there are inscriptions that describe how people obeyed the pharaoh's Ka, or that the pharaoh gives a man his Ka, which can be interpreted as the pharaoh becoming the internal commanding voice of a person. It also explains what these things are. These are Ka statues, and they're essentially just a statue of the pharaoh, which was created after he died, and it created a place for the Ka to live. The Ka would inhabit the statue. But just as those statues of gods may have been aids to auditory hallucinations, the Ka statue may have been a way to kind of produce auditory hallucinations and speak to the dead pharaoh after he had died. Which is why they went to great lengths to create these Ka statues. But not only that, but these Ka statues were used in a ritual ceremony after the pharaoh had died, called the opening of the mouth ceremony. This is a ritual ceremony that was done after the pharaoh had died in order to open the mouth of the Ka statue so that he would be able to speak. But now it's kind of weird. What do you mean that the pharaoh would be able to speak unless you posit the possibility that the pharaoh could still be heard after he had died through auditory hallucinations? And there's more evidence for this because there are often these depictions of the god Khnum, this bull-headed god, who was said to create people. But whenever he creates people, he creates both the body of the person and the Ka. And if you look closely at this carving, you can see that Khnum is creating the Ka, but the Ka is pointing at his mouth. This seems to suggest that the Ka may have actually been the internal voice of that person. That's why he's pointing at his mouth. Now, before I go, there are many subtleties that are worth exploring. For example, I've slowly begun to believe that it's wrong to consider the bicameral mind a distinct mentality from consciousness. It's possible that people were conscious and had a bicameral mind in a sense, that they had both an ego, but they also could experience auditory hallucinations. It's not necessarily one or the other. Just as schizophrenics today can have an ego, it's just that the ego tends to be dissolved rather easily. It's also possible that the pharaoh and the priests were the only ones really capable of experiencing hallucinations and speaking with the gods. And this might be why pharaonic marriages were highly incestuous. Pretty creepy, but from a biological perspective, kind of interesting to think that these incestuous marriages kind of kept the genes for being able to experience auditory hallucinations in the divine lineage. But as civilization became more and more complex, it seems that we transitioned to a more conscious mentality. And something like the gods and hallucinations, it seemed to be less feasible as a way to actually exert social control. But even after consciousness erupts and the gods seem to stop speaking, we're the descendants of that earlier mentality. And so we don't just get rid of gods right away. We still worship them and we still believe in them. That's arguably why there are still gods around today, and why we still go to church in order to commune with the god. But yeah, that's all I have. If you want to continue this discussion, please feel free to join us on Patreon, where you'll get access to the Discord server, and we can continue to discuss this on there. And I'll be really curious to know if you guys had any more information about this, any more inscriptions, any more lines of evidence which could suggest the bicameral mind, or even anything interesting about ancient Egypt at all. Because again, it's a very vast topic, and I'm sure there are people out there who know a lot more than me. But yeah, thanks for watching, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.